Now we have seen some demo how ChatGPT could be used for language translation and compared its performance with Google Translator. We should also ponder an important question. When you are comparing two different language translators, how do you compare them and what should be the common metrics to gauge the efficacy, efficiency, and the utility of different language translators? Now, I'm going to provide you here a list of metrics that you can use to, you know, gauge the utility of any language translator or to compare two different language translator like Google Translator and ChatGPT. First thing you should be seeing is like what is the translation accuracy, and this should be a most fundamental metric, and you need to check whether the translator conveys the meaning of the original text or not, right? And if a translator is good, then it should be able to convey the meaning of the original content, original native content, when it's translating it to a different language. Second, it also matters that you compare the fluency and the naturalness of the translation. Okay, if the translation has happened, is it fluent or is it natural to a native person or not, should be another metric of gauging the translation done by any translator. Vocabulary and terminology is also important. You have to understand that there are specific set of words and a specific set of vocabulary or terminology is used in a given language. Whether that vocabulary and terminology is appropriate in the translation or not is an important metric that needs to be considered when comparing different language translators. Grammar and syntax is very common and important, right? When the translation should be grammatically correct and the syntax should be right, and if it is not done by any language translator, then that's not an efficient language translator. Finally, contextual understanding. You need to understand how the translator captures the context of the source text, and that is also an important metric. In the demos, when I spoke about like Google Translator and also showed you about ChatGPT language translation capabilities, I mainly focused on the translation accuracy and also focused on the contextual understanding aspect of it. But there are other metrics that could be also used to compare two different language translators. So here I want to give you a quick overview of a very cursory and qualitative analysis that I carried out about the language translation capabilities of Google Translator and ChatGPT, and those are based upon just browsing of the website and seeing how users are liking different translators. Now it turns out with the recent survey that I have done on several websites with user comments and so forth and so on, nearly 70% of the users like the performance of the ChatGPT, whereas 30% of the users are still focusing on using Google Translator as the main media to do the language translator. One of the advantages with the Google Translator is that it is capable of doing language translation across hundreds of languages, and still ChatGPT is not good in that many languages and so forth, right? And that is the main reason why some people still like Google Translator. Again, don't take my word for it, it's just a qualitative analysis, but that's the general trend I'm seeing in the market and based upon the comment provided by different users. But here, let me give you an insight into some of the performance of ChatGPT based upon actual research paper, which basically did the language translation comparison between Google and between ChatGPT language translation capabilities and three other translator, one of them in Google Translator and a couple of them research prototype translation that here. So here is the reference. Is ChatGPT a good translator? Yes, with GPT-4 as the engine, and you can read this paper. This is an interesting read which focuses more on language translation, and you can also understand a little bit more about what are the metrics and what are the how you gauge the capabilities of language translation. But I want to talk about two main things. The first is the conclusion of the paper. So they find that the ChatGPT performs competitively on a high resource European languages, but lags behind significantly on the low resource or the distant language. And the way they define high resource language is the language which has been, for which there is a lot of data available, which is widely used, and there are text corresponding to those languages on the web. Whereas the low resource languages are those which are not widely used but are spoken, and there is a very less amount of data with respect to those languages on the web. And this is why, since ChatGPT is a large language model learning from deep learning, and it requires a lot of data to train itself. And that's why typically they have observed that the ChatGPT performance is really good in high resource languages capabilities, whereas it's not so great on the low resource or the distant language capabilities. So that's the key conclusion that you can get out from the paper. So it also, sort of gives you an affirmation that the ChatGPT language translation capabilities are really good. Second and interesting thing that I want to discuss, and it was a key insight that was there in the paper, that they also discussed an interesting strategy which is known as pivot prompting, which improves the translation performance of ChatGPT also for the low resource or distance. So its performance was not great, but they used an interesting prompt engineering idea, and that helped improving the translation accuracy of the ChatGPT for low resource language. Now, we are going to be talking about the prompt engineering in the next lesson, which is an important topic altogether, but I also want to allude to you that within the context of language translation, let's discuss this idea of pivot prompting. Now, when we do a talk about pivot prompting for language translation, what it specifically means that we provide the ChatGPT the following prompt. Please provide the PIV, which is the native language or a pivot language, translation from the first and then the target translation from these sentences one by one. So let me give you an example. What does this mean? What essentially is done in the pivot prompting is, first, the ChatGPT is asked to take one language and translate that into a pivot language. For example, if we are doing translation between Hindi to Chinese, then it will ask, the pivot prompt will ask to take the Hindi text and translate into a pivot language, which in this case, or in majority of the case, will be English. Okay, so take Hindi, translate it into English, and then take all the sentences that are generated in the English sentences one by one. So one sentence each, one by one, and then translate that into Chinese. So this is known as pivot prompting for language translation. So rather than directly translating from Hindi to Chinese, first take a Hindi text, translate it to English, and take one by one sentences of the English and then translate it to Chinese. So there is an indirect translation that is happening, and that is the key idea behind the pivot prompting. And it has shown promise in doing language translation for cases where there is not data between two languages itself, and you can use a lot of data pertaining to English language itself to do the pivoting and getting more accurate results. So let's see a demo how pivot prompting could be used for language translation using ChatGPT. Okay, so here is the pivot prompting example, right? What I'm writing to ChatGPT is, please provide the English translation first and then the Chinese translation for these sentences one by one. So I'm giving the same quote in Hindi, translating it in English, and then asking the ChatGPT to translate in Chinese, right? So let's put this prompt in ChatGPT and see what your ChatGPT comes up, right? So please provide the English translation first and then the Chinese translation for these sentences one by one for the following text is the prompt that I have given. So you will see what ChatGPT is doing. First of all, it will provide the English translation for the Hindi, text that I have provided, and then it will basically translate the whole thing into an English, right? So here it has translated out one thought, make that thought your life, think about it, dream about it, and build your life around it. For that single specific sentence, it has converted this as a Chinese. So one sentence to one sentence in Chinese. And then the second is, let your brain, muscles, nerves, every part of your body be full of that thought. It has taken this sentence and converted this into Chinese. And then the third sentence is, again, has been converted into a Chinese, right? So this is known as pivot prompting for language translation between, two different languages using English as a pivot language. So I just want to quickly point out that this is also a prompting strategy that could be widely used for translation between two different languages for which there is not a lot of training data that is available.